Hi, Divesters. My name is Rudinav Vincent, and I am the founder and CEO of Divest, where diversity meets inclusion at work. Divest democratizes content rich experiences, knowledge sharing, and best practices presented by DEI, HR, and business leaders from a wide range of industries who are making the business case in diversity, equity, and inclusion. In order to drive growth and provide leaders like you with opportunities, we present actionable insights that may help you with the challenges you face today and lead in creating the organization of the future. We believe this is what modern organizations need to look like. So let's jump right into it. Hi, my next guest for today is a very dear friend, someone whom I have personally admired, and someone who knows how to push people through their limits. Someone who's really gone beyond limits and moved the needle when it comes to diversity practices. A perfect blend between technology and diversity is what I really call this personality. We have among us Matthew Yezi, organizational and behavioral scientist, equality advocate, and D&I strategist. Matthew is an organizational and behavioral scientist with 17 years of diversity, equality, and inclusion experience. As a strategic director at Collective, Matthew is focused on bringing comprehensive measurable solutions to the diversity space. He is the founder and CEO of Others Project, the first real-time consolidated and open source initiative dedicated to diversity and inclusion data. He currently serves as an advisor on a number of boards, such as Project Include, a nonprofit that uses data and advocacy to accelerate diversity and inclusion solutions in the tech industry, Spot, a company creating artificial intelligence reporting tools that makes it safer for employees to speak up on issues of harassment and discrimination, Women 2.0, a company encouraging direct action about gender equity and equality. Matthew was on the global ethics and compliance founding team at Google, where he had the responsibility for risk assessments, compliance training, and technology procurement. He later worked with the co-founders of Twitter as they created the precursor to Medium and assisted the KPOS Center for Social Impact on several diversity and inclusion projects. Matthew has been featured on several international conferences as a keynote speaker. He has spoken on diversity and corporate culture issues and has been interviewed by Harvard Business Review, San Francisco Chronicle, BuzzFeed News, CNBC, and Telegraph. Matthew, a very dear friend, thank you so much for being a part of this program.
Oh, thank you for having me, Rudy. You make me sound so good. I love this. This is great. I'm really excited to get to chat with you today.
You are an awesome person, of course.
Well, you are as well. So this is going to hopefully be an interesting conversation. Yeah, I'm really excited to chat.
Thank you, Matthew. We are seeing each other after almost 2 years, I believe.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, it's been a little too long. I think, yeah, it's the pandemic definitely has, I think, shifted a lot of how we're engaging. And I think also the nature of kind of this business as well. I think oftentimes, especially now, people have been looking for resources and figuring out how to contextualize what's been happening in the equity and inclusion space. But yeah, it's been a little too long since we've both connected, but it's really great to be able to reconnect with you.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure. And a lot has changed in the last 2 years we've seen.
100%. Yeah, this is, I always wonder to what extent are we really kind of thinking about these changes? I mean, across several levels. The pandemic has clearly shown that there has been a reconciliation that needs to happen with how companies have been treating employees. We oftentimes hear terms like the great sort of resignation. And I really have a hesitancy kind of talking about it and contextualizing it in that way, because it puts a lot of the burden, whether intentionally or unintentionally, on an employee's behavior. Like the employees are the ones leaving in droves for whatever reasons. And I think of, honestly, this topic as sort of more, especially in the last few years, as more of a great reconciliation instead of a great resignation, because we're reconciling what companies have failed to do in terms of stepping up in terms of their business practices and how they're treating employees. And they're having to reconcile that with the fact that employees are saying this is no longer enough for us. But it's interesting to see, yeah, how people are contextualizing these issues and seeing how, the focus has been on how women have been doing a lot of the work when it comes to unpaid labor that keeps teams together in terms of communication, and also just in general, how women have been treated even during this pandemic, managing their households as well as managing careers at the same time, but not being recognized for that additional work. So it's been fascinating, in some really insightful ways, but also just kind of not surprising but unfortunate ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually very unfortunate that the ones who suffered the most from the pandemics in organizations have actually been women, and that's just
Yeah,
sad.
and yeah, and I think that if you ask a lot of individuals about that, it's work that is compounded, and it's unpaid labor that is compounded upon, I think, and it becomes even worse, I think, in spaces where the pandemic has sort of shown there to be these gaps already. So, women already deal with a wage gap when it comes to how their work is valued within an organization.
Sure.
And so they also sort of take on these tasks internally at companies that, oftentimes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, women are asked to take notes more often. Women are asked to do more of the admin work, more of the, can you help get the team some water, more of the logistics. And I feel like, that type of behavior, oftentimes, because we go to a remote setting, it just doesn't disappear. And so now that we see the frustration kind of coming, I think even more so because, schools are closing and there's different schedules, and there's just an added layer of stress that I think get put on women in particular in these workplace
Sure.
settings, where individuals who don't have that line of sight to understand what that discriminatory behavior looks like will continue to act in the same way. And it oftentimes gets worse in these environments. So we're seeing a gradual trend of women leaving these situations in higher numbers than before. And I think a lot of that is because, it's just like, I've already been on the receiving end of this at work, and it's only getting worse as a result of how they're treating employees during the pandemic, the lack of ability to manage remotely. And so if you don't have to deal with those situations, why stay in that kind of situation from the first place?
That's true. In fact, it looks more like, we are moving one step ahead and two steps behind.
Yeah, and I think that for the most part, that's, I think, where most equity programs exist. I think we were forced to reconcile with a lot of these issues during the pandemic for obvious reasons, because we're dealing with this global crisis. But at the same time, when you talk to underrepresented groups, marginalized groups within workplaces, these issues aren't new. When you talk to immigrants who are in come from different countries, who come to a new workplace in a foreign country, the accent discrimination is very real. How people are treated when it comes to how they're engaging in the workplace is very real. And this behavior where we treat ins and out groups as sort of as separates, particularly within the workplace, again, the pandemic really just exposed and put a magnifying glass on issues that were already prevalent, and these things that were bad workplace behavior that already existed. And so what we're starting to see now is just things that were easily hidden or not even talked about are coming to the surface. And I think that's what we're starting to see in terms of how employees are engaging, like that's starting to become more prevalent, I think, as we discuss these issues.
So, I mean, clearly there's an issue or when it comes to corporate culture with organizations. I mean, so how do you think companies are, addressing these issues?
They're not. They're not. That's the problem, I think, is a lot of companies are aware that from the bottom line that, people leaving in droves is probably a bad thing. You need people to run your companies. You need people to do the work. And I think for the most part, and it's really unfortunate, I'm not seeing companies adjust in the ways that actually tend to be more employee forward. You know, in the United States in particular, we're starting to see more talk about unionization efforts and talk about raising employee working standards and conditions. Just generally, you know, affording more benefits to employees that are just on par with, you know, giving people some leeway to have some kind of life as they're navigating these jobs.
Right.
And it's the bare basics. It's like having, you know, sick time off. It's having parental leave when you have a child. It's the most basic of things that I think in other countries they seem to say that these are human rights issues and are a given that people are going to have these things. And so I think companies are trying to address these issues in a way that they're used to addressing in kind of the old school approach of how they think about and contextualize employee relations issues. And the problem fundamentally is that HR groups and HR functions have fundamentally been created in service to the shareholders and the owners of that organization. And so when you have this conflict from the beginning of these groups and the expectation that these groups are supposed to be advocating for employee rights and benefits, they're put in the position of deciding whether or not they're going to be more company forward leaning or more employee forward leaning. And for better or worse, what ends up winning out, I think, is the bottom line. It's like, what's going to make the company more money? What's going to protect the company from risk more often? And when those are the decision-making variables or the decision-making factors that go into that, they're going to side with the organization in terms of how they're going to continue approaching that practice. And I'm not seeing that shift, and I'm not seeing these professionals in HR step into that conversation as audaciously and heavily as I would have wished. But they're also put in a position to where, you know, if they speak up or out into these conversations, they could be fired too. So I don't judge them for the lack of ability or understanding that. It's just they're in a role that fundamentally is geared to not necessarily put those employee issues forward in a way, or they're not given agency to be able to shift those conversations within their own organization. So you know, nothing happens and the end result is nothing happens.
Absolutely, Matthew. In fact, you've worked with some of the best tech brands. I mean, and you've seen hits, you've seen failures with their DEI programs. Where are companies lacking?
The big area where I think companies end up lacking in terms of engagement is making sure that people are clear on what it is they're actually trying to accomplish. And it's so sad that I think the highest level of like the problem is that there's a lack of understanding of the goals of what it is you're trying to accomplish with any of your equity and diversity inclusion programming. Like just setting clear, tangible targets and goals in terms of what that means for employees is near impossible, and at all levels. So oftentimes I tell companies, you know, you should have a code of conduct or some kind of guiding principles that at least help individuals understand how the organization functions and which things are important and valuable to how the organization runs. And people are like, oh, you mean that thing you put on the wall that talks about integrity and this and that? And I'm like, the flippancy that I think people talk about those things is, I think, very, very showing of how companies have not necessarily shown to employees how they operate and how they function. And I think that that's very problematic. So as a result of having a lack of accountability and a lack of awareness of what the goals actually are for these programs and for engagement, that turns into a lack of an ability for the company across various functions and employee grade levels to be able to even understand what it means to be an inclusive organization, because they have no, I like to talk about these codes, the codes of conduct, as like Rosetta Stones of an organization. There's no common thing. There's no common anchor for individuals to say, okay, when they talk about treating people equitably, that means this in India, that means this in the United States, that means this in England. How are we differing from how we're approaching that same terminology or that same language and how we interpret this in our own local cultures in terms of like also how the company perceives this? And so because it's not oftentimes always just a US based approach when you're dealing with international organizations as well. So when you don't even have that touchstone to say we're going to want to make sure that we treat employees fairly and equally, in some area parts of the world, that means there's an assumption that women just aren't as intelligent as men. That's like a going cultural assumption that women just don't perform as well as men in sciences or different parts of things that would be valued in their jobs. And so if that's the starting factor, you're going to have a very different viewpoint on what equity means, because it's shaded by your own biases and your own cultural biases of what equality and equity means. And so someone else in a different country saying it is going to interpret that very differently. But when the CEOs and leaders of these organizations aren't even talking about those things being valuable and important to the organization, then there's no focus or energy or effort going to be put into even understanding where the differences could lie in interpreting what these values are. So from the highest level, I think that tends to be the biggest problem that I see. There's just no direction and a lack of clear goals and accountability.
And companies. Companies are they working towards this? I mean, is there some parameters based on which they can actually increase the rate of success?
I think for the most part, this is the tough thing that I'm seeing right now is these initiatives tend to be more employee driven or HR driven. And so you're only going to be as good at implementing a program as your executives are at promoting and being behind that work. And so when it's driven by HR and HR reports, 2 levels down from a chief operating officer, there's very little line of sight to senior leadership to be able to fundamentally shift how people are investing in this. And so what ends up happening is HR functions end up almost appearing to beg for resources and appear to be asking for things in this way of like, we need more benefits. And employees are telling us they want more time off and they're looking for mental health benefits and leave as an option because we're going through some we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate these issues. And the families are dealing with childcare situations that are completely different and can shift at any given moment in time, and just dealing also with the stress of navigating even your own relationships and personal and your professional ones, your home ones, your like close family and extended family. Like there's so many things going on there. And HR, professionals oftentimes hear this feedback and they're like trying to advocate for this, and senior leadership may not oftentimes, they almost have to be sold this, they have to be sold that you need to treat your employees well. And that's unfortunate. And the other area where I see employees kind of also running into this problem is employee resource groups. Like they're being tasked and being told, particularly along racial lines, you're a member of a Black employee engagement network or Indigenous one or Latinx group, and we want or an Asian affinity group, and we want to figure out how what we can do to help you all. And there's some positive to the engagement of like, okay, well, the company is at least trying to talk about these things. But fundamentally, you have to think about this as saying, look, all the company is trying to do is put the labor of what the problems are onto the people who are experiencing these problems and having them solve the problems without having the agency to actually shift things. So the outcome can oftentimes be exactly what happens with HR professionals, in that these employee research groups end up looking like they're complaining and they're problematic. And as opposed to companies maybe engaging with people who've quit, who used to work there because they were in an underrepresented group, and maybe reaching out to them instead to say what were the mitigating factors. So they put the pressure on the individuals who are at risk of also losing their job. So it's a very unfortunate way, I think, of dealing with this. But the reality is that that's how companies have kind of been looking at these problems and trying to put efforts into it. But I say trying to put efforts into it it tends to be a bottoms up approach. I'm not seeing a whole lot that's from the top down.
That's true. In fact, it would be interesting to see data on how many CEOs and managing directors have an HR background as compared to marketing, engineering, and finance background, because those have been, the favorite spots when it comes to, stakeholders, winning stakeholders, winning customers. Okay, the person at the top has to be, either someone who's got an engineering background, who was the CMO of the company, someone who was the head of finance because he's good at managing numbers. But then, people is everything.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think you necessarily have to have an HR background or to be successful at dealing with this. If you know your own strengths and you also are building a team around you and a trusted group of advisors who can fill the gaps where you are the weakest. And I think that that's what I think a lot of executives have a problem with, is they don't understand that they are lacking in an ability to engage with companies. And I've worked with some companies who have amazing CEOs who are running product, and it's very clear that they're more product focused. But they're also self-aware that they lack the ability to be able to engage with employees in a fundamentally meaningful way. And so what they've done is hired either co-founders, or they've hired chief operating officers to work alongside them, who understand and appreciate that aspect of that conversation and can actually be delegated the authority to be able to do that work. And so there's a case to be made on why chief diversity officers work directly with executive teams. It's also that for that reason, right? I like to say that your equity programming or your inclusion programming is only going to be as good as the sum of the lived experiences of the decision makers of the organization. And so the individuals, you may not necessarily have a robust group of decision makers, but as long as several decision makers have additional layers to their lived experiences and their identities and how they kind of engage with employees and how they talk about these issues. And they have agency to be able to shift these conversations from an executive level. That's where I think you start to see real change. And I think that, having the background would be great, to your point. Absolutely. If they've had a background in managing people, if they understood the importance of making sure people feel engaged, that's your most powerful win. But if that's not necessarily going to be readily available, the ability to understand your strengths and weaknesses and to hire out individuals who can complement you in those ways, also equally valuable and important as you're growing your organization. So, but there's the lack of emotional intelligence, I think, when it comes to that I see oftentimes with executives.
Oh, absolutely. That's very well said, Matthew. We've been talking so much about human resources. So, just taking a point on human resources as a function, it's becoming more and more critical, especially for the company well-being. What do you think are, some of the most vital role that human resources play in diversity and inclusion practices, especially given how workplaces have and, continue to evolve?
Yeah, so I think HR groups are in a really tough position, and I don't envy. I think a lot of the issues in having to navigate, and a lot of difficulty that they're having to navigate sort of on a daily basis. Like, I don't envy that work because it is very difficult. And I think the problem, though, fundamentally lies, we have to sort of point out the elephant in the room, right? The HR functions have had initially developed and have evolved to work in service, again, to shareholders and to the organization and to the company's interests. And so HR individuals typically are trained to look at risk in a very different way when it comes to how employees are treated and how they are engaged with the company. And for better or worse, that has caused, I think, HR functions to oftentimes do the things that they're not supposed to do. A great example. A great example of this, I think, is when an HR function wants to manage out an employee. Um, they're put on these performance improvement plans. They're told that they're not up to par when it comes to their performance and how they're operating with the company. And it's like this very passive aggressive way to be able to get rid of an employee, but to do it I would say it's like legalized bullying. It's being able to say, well, you just don't fit here. Is this a place you really want to be in the next 3 years? Like they think they're being kind to an individual by creating these false paths to improvement, when the reality is oftentimes when people get put on these improvement plans, it really is just riding on the wall of like, how quickly are you going to be leaving this organization? And so there aren't honest conversations that end up happening about looking out for the employee to say, look, we'll pay you severance so that you can focus on that 100%. Instead, they're given a false hope that if they work really hard in these areas, that they're going to be able to improve. In some cases, that may be the case, but in most often, the outcome in those performance improvement plan kind of issues is the termination of the employee. And so the HR functions aren't bad at equity issues. It's just they are good at protecting the company. So we oftentimes try to like villainize HR as being bad at doing HR. No, they're great at their jobs. They're great at offboarding employees. They're great at protecting the company's interests. They're just really terrible at being employee forward in how they're trying to approach these topics. And I know that it might feel like a bit of a cynical approach, but that's embedded in how an HR function actually operates. And HR leaders who at the top are wanting to have more equitable programming and work within their organizations, and how they're having to integrate that into from the highest level, like that's a very different thing, because that's again that speaks more to the level of executives at the top wanting to be engaged and executives wanting the company as a whole to thrive. Not that the HR function should be the moral police of an organization. That's where I think we start getting into trouble, is when we start thinking about equity programming as being a responsibility of HR. HR only sees the outcomes of the processes that are already normalized and put into place in a company's culture. So like things that already exist as a part of the company's culture exist, and HR has the data to look at the trends and things that show the healthiness or the well-being of what that company's inclusion programming or that inclusion value-driven approach looks like. And so I think we have to kind of start being a bit more realistic about what the function is versus what it represents and how much agency they're actually given to shift things. Inclusion programming covers all areas, and it's everyone's responsibility to be engaged in that conversation. And it's not HR's responsibility to shift that or to manage that. And I think that that's why we get ourselves into a lot of trouble, is when you start doing that, then you start making HR groups the moral police of these conversations. And I think that that's not a great place for them to be.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not just HR's function, it's everybody's responsibility to bring about diversity and inclusion practices.
Absolutely. And you see it as, in particular, I think HR has a good line of sight into what this looks like. And again, yes, they're only going to get as good as the support that they have from their executive leadership. So a great example would be, a CEO wants to goes out and says, it's important to us that underrepresented individuals in our company are promoted, and we want to make sure we're addressing the gender gap, wage gap. And we want to make sure that these issues are addressed, because as an organization, this is not an organization that I want to run if we are allowing these types of things to exist. And so, great, you have a CEO coming out, telling you what the value is, telling you what the goals are, and telling you exactly what everyone needs to be rowing towards. And the reality, though, is that that's only as good as it trickles to every part of the function of the organization. So you may have a sales group and a micro function of a different, like a sub function of a sales group, where the manager is just tremendously misogynist, where the manager is just tremendously bad, but gets away with the behavior because they meet their sales goals, they're able to move forward really quickly with deals, and they show potential positive impact to the organization. But everyone who works under that one manager they're miserable. And you talk to any one of them and they hate their jobs, they hate coming into work. They despise that engagement every day. So regardless of what the CEO says, you have individuals who are getting discriminated against in these very direct or maybe indirect ways. And that manager who's not going to see any repercussions from it. So HR may have data to support then, okay, look, we're seeing pockets of where this could be an issue with culture surveys, and we're seeing where these issues can come into play. But it really fundamentally comes down with, how do you deal with behavior that works against what the things are that we're saying is important to the organization? And so if HR isn't given the agency to be able to reprimand that individual, or to be able to put in policies, to put in trainings to get these managers, these first level managers, to be able to address these kinds of issues, then no matter what the CEO says, that behavior is not going to shift. And so that's where I think we run into those issues. Is HR is aware of these things. And I think oftentimes HR professionals, for the most part, do try to really do want to enact better change for the organization. But a fundamental issue around how you value income versus how you value whether employees are happy is one that a lot of companies have. And how people are rewarded. And so if you don't have these things that actually can negate that, in terms of, getting a warning or getting talked to by your manager about like your bad managing behavior, then it means nothing. So we really kind of have to there's a lot of layers to the problem. But I think, HR professionals are oftentimes aware in the first group to be able to help shift the conversation in the right way. It's just these conversations tend to not necessarily be one-off things. They tend to be broader things that need to be addressed from the company as a whole.
Right. Coming to my last question, Matthew, I mean, how can we increase competency-based learning to help equip our next generation of DEI leaders? Or as a matter of fact, any professionals who are looking at, being involved in diversity and inclusion practices?
I think the number one thing that can happen with people who are looking, one, this is, I want to sound too cynical, but I'll be very honest. Don't go into an equity job. We're people like myself are working to do this work. We're training to be VCR repair persons. Like we're the old way of thinking about what equity and inclusion. We're trying to repair leaky ships. We're dealing with issues that are archaic, from an archaic way of setting up these issues with old technology. We're learning how to be proficient and good at dealing with old technology. The reality is, if anyone's looking at this, particularly younger professionals are looking at getting into this space, the way you make the most impact is by being a leader of an organization that you're bringing those principles into it as a result of you doing that work. So look to get jobs as the CEO or the chief operating officer, because if you're underrepresented and marginalized and you're working in an executive position, that has way more impact than what one lower or mid-level person would have to be engaging in that dialogue and trying to win over executives on what the importance is for this. So we need more individuals to be in the VC space. We need more underrepresented and marginalized individuals to be starting their own companies. We need individuals to be working their ranks up within sort of their own functions, their engineering functions, their sales functions, to be able to do this. Because right now we treat DEI and DEIB kind of adjacent programming as an othery kind of thing. Like it's always spoken of as an extra thing. And the more we do that, the more we alienate what that programming can look like successfully, because we're thinking it has to be an integrated thing into the larger whole. Whereas you bringing those principles as a result of your own personal journey and your own lived experiences into a job where you do have agency within an organization to shift things, by being the chief marketing officer, you're inherently going to be addressing those principles of equity by virtue of the work that you do, by you showing up. So that's, I think, an important thing I think people need to kind of understand is the work that I do right now is really just to triage things until we get a next generation of leaders who are actually in charge and managing these issues in a way that actually shifts fundamentally these problems away from these historically marginalized groups not having agency in their own day-to-day lives. So the way you get better is by just being good at what you do, continuing to follow what you're passionate about, but do that within the context of like getting more agency within an organization and working your way into those executive spots and working your way into starting your own company, working your way into creating your own efforts to address these things. That's how you shift it.
Wow, amazing, Matthew. Thank you so much. I mean, this brings us to the end of our episode, and I really want to thank you for all your inputs. I mean, people across the world are going to enjoy this. And Matthew, thank you once again. I mean, keep rising, keep shining, blessings and good wishes.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for taking the time too. I think, yeah, one last note to leave people on is, this work is difficult and taxing, right? So for everyone out there who's listening, like give yourself a little bit of grace as you start having these conversations, as you start talking about these issues. We're on the right side of history here. People are going to look back in 30, 40 years and say, wow, you mean you needed someone to like talk about like having parental leave? Like that was a thing you had to advocate for. Like things will shift as time goes on. Yes. And we're at the cusp of really seeing some tremendous shifts, I think, in workplace culture. And so the more lonely you can feel in doing this work, just understand that the loneliness is there because you're helping to pave the path for others to be able to continue this work. So it's important to give yourself some credit and recognition that you're on the right side of history with any of these types of initiatives and this type of work. And so you shouldn't, that's no small feat. And so you do feel tired and exhausted because this is exhausting work, but be proud of that work that you do, because every tiny thing that you do just improves it for the next generation of professionals out there. So thank you for taking the time to chat.
Well, thank you so much. This is a lovely message that we're going to close this podcast on, Matthew. Thank you once again. I mean, and good luck.
Likewise. Take care.
Take care. As Matthew rightly pointed out, the pandemic has shown that there's reconciliation that needs to happen on how companies have been treating their employees, especially women who have had to manage their households and their careers and never really got recognized for the kind of work that they're doing. Companies need to be clear on what they're trying to accomplish. At the same time, leaders who lack the ability to engage with employees in a more fundamental and meaningful manner will need to have a trusted set of advisors, if not COOs and co-founders, who can do that part of the work for them. There's a business case on why chief diversity officers need to work directly with the executive leadership team. Your inclusion programming is only going to be as good as the sum of all the lived experiences of your decision makers. Inclusion programming is everyone's responsibility, not just human resources. Rather than jumping into an equity job as an underrepresented or a minority group, aim at being a part of the executive leadership team. Aim at becoming the CEO or COO, or as a matter of fact, start your own company. In this manner, you're going to create a lot more impact on people and win over executives purely based on your lived experiences and personal journey. The way you get better is by being good at what you do, continuing to follow your own path, and work your way into creating your own efforts to addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. DiveFesters, we invite you to connect with us if you have any specific challenges or concerns that you would like us to discuss as a part of our series. There's so much to learn and do, whether you want to join the conversation or sit back and take it all in. Remember to subscribe to our podcast, DiveFest Global, to hear from DEI, HR, and business leaders about their successes and challenges on their journey to creating an environment where employees feel a genuine sense of inclusion and belonging. You may also like to visit our website, divefestglobal.com, to find webinars where we feature your fellow peers and go in depth on what organizational DEI really looks like. So thank you once again for joining us today. Good luck and stay blessed.